First of all, good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
Good to join you. I'm so struck by how this little vigil online probably bears a lot of resemblances to that little vigil 2,000 years ago that we're pointing to, dominantly female. Yeah, a few people keeping hope for a lot of people. So it's good to join you. I think John and Ashley were surprised. I said yes, but this is a gift to me too. So I want to say thank you to that. And I want to say thank you to, don't want to embarrass John, but I want to thank John publicly for his work as he continues to keep us gathered, continues to keep us sort of relying on one another and keep us moving forward. So Janelle has figured out how to make clapping hands on there. I like that. That's wonderful. You might have to send me a text message about how to do that. Well, I guess I want to say three things. I want to say that Holy Saturday is, I think, a treasure that has been largely sort of undervalued by and large because it is part of the rhythm of life with God. And that is, indeed, we do suffer like Friday. Indeed, we do feel forsaken like Friday. Even Jesus felt that way. That's why I think Jesus is not only the risen Christ, but Jesus can befriend. Jesus knows something about the lonesome road, and some of us have known something of a lonesome road. If I were with you, I'd say amen, but you don't have to say that. I know something of being a human being. There's a lonesome road sometimes. There's a season of lonesomeness sometimes, and you wonder sometimes if your prayers are stopping at the ceiling. That's Friday. And then in the rhythm comes the silence. John was making reference to a gathering that we convened about, I guess, more than a year ago or so, John, where we decided to talk about the fact that silence is a large part of what it means to be faithful. And at least we had not, at least in my time, had not really talked about that part. In as much as music is comprised of notes and rests, so is faith comprised of prayer and action and silence. Of course, this is the least popular part of a life with God because what gets stirred up in silence is all our stuff. Our abandonment stuff, our own inner narratives, other narratives that have been put on us. This questioning if this is all isn't, we're being too serious about a life with God and nobody else is, and we've somehow made a fool's choice. All that gets stirred up in the silence. And then, of course, after the silence, comes that epiphany, comes that revelation, comes God's surprise, comes resurrection, comes Easter. And so those are the movements. And this is really important to hold them together. When I was a rector of a congregation, I used to ask people, stay with me through Holy Week so we can feel that whole rhythm, because that whole rhythm is so important as life lengthens. And so I want to say just three things here. I've already been with Janelle this week at Candler, so she's had quite enough of me by now. But let me just give you 3 points. One, this reading from Lamentations that was read is probably one of the more beautiful lessons that there are. And I want you to notice how it moves from affliction to faith. Did you see that where Jeremiah moves from words like, I have seen affliction under the wrath of God, under the rod of God's wrath. He has made my flesh waste away, broken my bones, besieged and enveloped me in bitterness and tribulation, etc. And then it moves. And before you know it, he finishes that with the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. And of course, that is the seed for the hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, Thou hand hath provided. Great is Thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. And so in between that giving voice of affliction And before you get to this sort of resolute confirmation that God has been good, is this period of silence. In fact, I got a response to the podcast that I put out just the other day where someone said, "How do you know that you know?" And boy, I wish I had an easy answer for that. But what happens in Lamentations is this journey with God. And so I guess number one, I want to encourage you is to be encouraged as we journey with God. Be encouraged as we face up to the silence. There is nothing in the silence that's greater than God. Nothing in the silence that's greater than God. There's nothing in our narratives that our unfortunate narratives that we carry around about shame and guilt and self-worth. There's nothing in there that is bigger or badder or better than God. And so we take all that into that silence. In fact, silence can be purging. The desert fathers, and I'm sure there were some desert mothers, used to invite us out into those places, because out into those places are where the soul can grow, where we confront that silence. And so, in our modern culture, we do everything we can to avoid silence. In fact, I see my own little kids here. Well, they're not so little, they're college age and high school age. And I see them, and I worry about younger generations who have had no practice with silence. Some of us who are older at least have had some practice with silence. And some of us have even experienced the music that happens in silence. In other words, the colors of it, the contours of it. Silence has its own words. Silence has its own way. It sounds crazy, but silence actually is music. I hope some people are experiencing some of that on pandemic. I think after you've Zoomed enough Zooms, and after you've FaceTimed enough FaceTimes and watched enough Netflix and Hulu, I don't know about you, but I crave a little bit of space. I've been going for walks or whatever it is, and I crave some of that space. And so, number one, I'm inviting us to increase our facility with silence. Some people love it in the morning. Some people love it in the afternoon. Some people love it in the evening. I happen to be a morning person. I really don't want any foolishness, any silliness. I don't even want the news immediately. I just want some silence, just some time to breathe. And I find that it's amazing, and maybe this happens to you, music comes back to me in the silence. A Bible verse comes back to me in the silence that I had no thought about previously. I was talking to a friend the other day, and I was amazed that the story of Noah came back to me in the silence. And I was using that story in the conversation about how ridiculous it was for Noah to build a boat in the desert, and all the ridicule he suffered and all the scorn up until the rainfall. Then he had lots of friends after that, right? So I wonder what's getting stirred up in you in the silence, because that's fodder for prayer. Push through the fear. Push through the fear. The words that God gives us is that we are God's beloved, made in God's image, fearfully and wonderfully made. And so whatever gets stirred up in us, whatever sad narratives, shame, guilt, all that sort of stuff gets stirred up in us in silence, we can say back to it those words that we are God's beloved. And that has sustained lots of people for a long time, to be able to push through those negative things that bubble up and fix ourselves on what God says about us. Number two, in the silence, Howard Thurman says, the great mystic Howard Thurman says, that we can find the sound of the genuine. So it's not just silence for silence, but it's sorting the silence to find what is genuine. What is your genuine voice? What is God's genuine voice? Bishop Curry has said 1,000 times, and he's going to keep on saying it, and it is this: if it ain't about love, it ain't about God. And so that's one of the earmarks, the benchmarks of what God has to say to us in silence. Love yourself, love God, love neighbor, right? It's never this sort of shard glass that comes up in us. Those are other narratives and those are other things. But when we get down to that sound of the genuine, God's voice, it's amazing that it always has to do with connectivity. I had a sabbatical some years ago, and I spend a lot of my time underneath old rusty cars in my garage. That's my thing, hobby. And it was amazing that it took about 30 days of doing nothing before I began to even hear from myself. You know, everything gets so compressed. Everything gets so busy. We're running from pillar to post. You know, we've got the news on in the background as entertainment, which is a tragic thing. And you don't even get to listen to yourself, let alone God. And so in the silence, we find the sound of the genuine. Maybe that's what's happening in Lamentations. Maybe he gets all that stuff that is real and legitimate out first. And then the second wave is, God is still faithful. New mercies I see every morning. My soul can rest in God's godness. So get it out first, and then what comes back to us in that second wave is the real stuff, the sound of the genuine. The third thing I want to say to you, and the last thing I want to say to you is, I'm reminded that we're having this conversation, this Holy Saturday conversation, in the face of a global pandemic. Let us not forget that. And I recognize that some people are really struggling under this government mandated, bishop mandated silence, and I get that. And the words that my wife and I were talking about the other day are some words that help me in the silence, and that is, we have to make some distinctions in the silence. And for that, you know, and maybe you could jot this down for your discernment, for your devotional time, some other time, is Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth, 2 Corinthians 4. Read the whole thing. It's exactly what the doctor ordered right now. But anyway, I'll just pick a few pieces here and then give you the full thing. Paul says this, and I'm starting at verse 7, but you can jump all over if you want. He says that you and I have a treasure in earthen jars. That's this flesh. And the point of that is that we can show the surpassing power of God, and we can be clear, because we're made of clay, because we're made of earth, that the power does not come from us. Now, here comes the pandemic conversation. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. In another translation, it says, we are afflicted, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Isn't he right? We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in us the body of the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. And so that's the other last thing I want to say about the silence. In the silence, we can make these really important distinctions, which begin to give us a rock to stand on. So Paul's giving his folks a rock to stand on when he says, we are afflicted, but we are not crushed. Right? So it is true, we are afflicted right now by this terrible virus that is stealing friends and family from us, stealing our physical time together from us, right? But in the quiet of this, we're also aware of the distinction. This is a hardship. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, but fear not, I have overcome the world. And so in the quiet, we get to pull things apart and make these distinctions that are so important. I remember a very difficult Holy Saturday time in my own life. And I remember when I wondered if I had any hope at all. I wondered if despair hadn't come to me. And then I took out my trusty Webster's dictionary. And I realized that despair is the absence of hope by definition. And then I realized I actually had some hope. I was just also having a whole lot of hardship and maybe a little bit of self-pity too. But I realized there was this seed of hope that was holding me, even when it seemed like God was not present, or God could not hear, or God chose not to act. And so those are a couple of thoughts that I have this morning on this Saturday vigil that you and I are keeping. And I would just say, we have a friend even in the silence. And so I encourage you to speak God's first language, which is silence, and to know that we're not forsaken, even when it seems like we're afflicted on every side.